Chapter 6. A Ghostly Telephone Call. Even with his longer legs, Pete had difficulty keeping up with his racing partner. Then his heart gave an extra leap. He heard footsteps right behind them. "Somebody," he gasped. "Somebody chasing us." Jupiter shook his head. "Just echoes off the wall," he panted. To Pete, the pursuing footsteps had an eerie quality that didn't sound like an echo, and didn't sound like footsteps made by anything human either. But at that moment, he and Jupiter left the wall behind, and the footsteps abruptly stopped chasing them. Apparently, Jupe was right again. Just more echoes. But it wasn't any echo that had caused the overwhelming feeling of terror which had gripped Pete back in the big round hall of Terror Castle. He knew that. He couldn't have kept from running for $1,000. They were slowing down now to get to the big boulders that narrowed the road to a footpath. But still they kept on running. It just seemed like a good idea. They rounded a bend in the road, and the dark, sinister building was no longer visible. Far down in the valley, the lights of Los Angeles twinkled, and there, parked 100 yards down the road, was the car with Worthington, the English chauffeur, waiting at the wheel. Pete and Jupiter had slowed down to a dog trot when unexpectedly, from far behind them came a shrill scream. It was a curious, piercing scream with a gurgling, bubbling quality to it, as if whoever was screaming had just... But Pete didn't care to think about what might have made the scream sound so funny. They reached the big, waiting Rolls-Royce, its golden door handles and metal parts gleaming in the starlight. Somebody flung the door open, and Pete fell into the rear, where Bob was waiting for them. Bob pulled Pete up into the seat as Jupiter piled in behind him. "Worthington," Jupiter shouted, "take us back home." "Very good, Master Jones," the tall, dignified chauffeur said, and the big car purred into life. It began to sweep down the curves towards the valley below, faster and faster. "What happened?" Bob asked, as, puffing, the other two fell back onto the leather-cushioned seat. "What was that scream?" "I don't know," Jupiter said. "I don't want to know," Pete amended the statement, "and if anybody else knows, I hope he doesn't tell me." "But what happened?" Bob asked. "Did you see the blue phantom?" Jupiter shook his head. "We didn't see anything, but just the same, something scared us silly." "Correction," Pete declared. "We were already silly. Something just scared us sillier." "Then the castle really is haunted?" Bob asked eagerly. "All those stories are true?" "As far as I'm concerned, it's headquarters for the Union of Ghosts, Ghouls and Werewolves of America," Pete declared, breathing easier now as the car took them ever farther from the spot. "It's one place we're never going to go again, are we?" He turned to Jupiter, who was sitting back, pinching his lower lip between thumb and forefinger, always a sign he was deep in thought. "We aren't ever going back, are we?" Pete repeated hopefully. But Jupiter Jones did not seem to hear him. He looked out the window of the racing car and continued to pinch his lip without answering. When the car finally reached the Jones salvage yard, Jupiter thanked Worthington and said he would phone next time he needed transport. "Better luck next time, Master Jones," the chauffeur said. "I must say, I am enjoying this assignment. It's a change from driving for fat bankers and rich old ladies." Then he drove off, and Jupiter led his partners into the junkyard. His Uncle Titus and Aunt Matilda were inside their little house which adjoined the yard. The boys could see them through the open window, watching television. "It's still early," Jupiter said. "We returned from our expedition sooner than I had planned." "But not half soon enough to suit me," Pete told him. He was still somewhat pale. Jupiter was pale too, but the stocky boy could be very stubborn at times, and admitting that he was scared was one of the things he was most stubborn about. Now he said, "I hope you recorded that scream on the tape recorder. If so, we can listen to it and attempt to identify it." "You hope I recorded the scream?" Pete yelled. "I was running, not recording. Or maybe you didn't notice." My instructions were to record all unusual sounds, Jupiter said. However, under the circumstances, I suppose you can't be blamed. Jupiter led them through Easy 3, their code name for the easiest entrance to headquarters. It was a big oak door, still in its frame, which seemed to be leaning against a pile of granite blocks from a demolished building. Jupiter walked over and fished a big, rusty iron key out of a box of junk, where no one would have given it a second look. He unlocked the oak door, pulled it open, and they ducked in. Now they were in an old iron boiler that had come from some monster steam engine. They walked through it, slightly stooped, and at the other end crawled through a round door directly into headquarters. Jupiter turned on the light and sat down behind the desk. "Now," he said, "we must evaluate what happened. Pete, what made you run from Terror Castle tonight?" "Nothing made me run," Pete told him. "I ran because I wanted to." "I will phrase the question differently. What made you want to run?" "Well," Pete said, "there in Echo Hall I first began to feel uneasy. Just uneasy. After a little while I was feeling extremely nervous. All of a sudden the extreme nervousness became sheer terror, and then I wanted to run." Jupiter pinched his lower lip. "Your experience was exactly the same as mine. First uneasiness, then extreme nervousness, then sheer terror. And yet, what really happened? We heard some echoes. We felt a cold draft." "An ice-cold draft," Pete corrected him. "And what about the picture that looked at me with a living eye?" "Probably only imagination," Jupiter told him. "We actually saw and heard nothing to frighten us. Yet we felt frightened. The question is, why?" "What do you mean, why?" Pete asked. "Any old deserted house is kind of frightening, and that place is so scary it would frighten spooks." "Perhaps that is the answer," Jupiter agreed. "We must visit Terror Castle again, and then the telephone rang. They stared at it. The telephone had never rung before. Jupiter had had it installed less than a week ago when they had definitely decided they would start some kind of business. They planned to pay the charges from the money they made repairing broken items for Mr. Jones. It was listed in Jupiter's name, but of course the listing hadn't been put in the telephone book yet. So far, no one else knew they had it. Yet here it was, ringing. It rang again. Pete gulped. "Well, answer it," he said. "I will." Jupiter picked it up. "Hello?" he said into the phone. "Hello." He held the phone close to a microphone and speaker he had assembled from parts of an old radio. This made it possible for them all to hear what was said. But all they could hear was a curious humming, far off. "Hello," he said once more. But there was still no answer, so finally he hung up. "Probably a wrong number," he stated. "As I was saying," the phone rang again. They stared at it. Jupiter reached for it as if someone was holding onto his arm for dear life. "Hello?" he said. They heard the strange humming again, sounding far off and lonesome. Then they heard a voice that seemed to be gargling, as if the speaker hadn't talked in years but was trying hard to say something. "Stay," the voice said. Then, as if it were a great effort, as if it were the most tremendous effort imaginable, the voice got out another word. "Away," it said. "Stay away." Then it died out in a long gasp, and again there was just a weird humming noise. "Stay away from what?" Jupiter asked the telephone. But the telephone didn't answer. It just went on humming. He hung up. For a long moment no one said anything. Then Pete stood up. "I've got to get home," he said. "I just remembered something I have to attend to." "Me too." Bob hopped up. "I'll go with you." "Possibly Aunt Matilda would like me to do some errands," Jupiter said, and he got up too. They practically fell over one another in their eagerness to get out of headquarters. The voice on the phone hadn't finished the sentence, but they didn't have any trouble figuring what he or it or whatever it was had been trying to tell them. "Stay away from Terror Castle."